In the summer of 2003, the Reed family, Andrew, Melissa, and their 3-year-old son, Noah, set out on what was meant to be a quiet weekend escape. The decision had been spontaneous, born from weeks of mounting stress at Andrew's architectural firm and Melissa's yearning to reconnect with a piece of her past. Their destination was Hollow Creek Reserve, a little-known, heavily wooded park in northern Oregon, mostly forgotten by time and barely marked on modern maps. The drive took them deep into the Cascade foothills, where cell phone towers grew sparse and the forest pressed close to winding roads that seemed to narrow with each passing mile. Melissa navigated using a hand-drawn map her mother had sketched from memory, pointing out landmarks that had remained unchanged since her own childhood visits decades earlier. It was a place Melissa remembered from her childhood. A hidden gem, she said, untouched by commercial tourism. As they wound deeper into the wilderness, the modern world seemed to fall away. No billboards advertising chain restaurants, no gas stations with their neon signs, no evidence of the 21st century at all. Just towering Douglas firs that had stood sentinel for centuries. Their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy so dense, it filtered the afternoon sunlight into a green, cathedral-like glow. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the summer air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. After parking their SUV on a barely visible dirt track, they hiked the final quarter-mile with their camping gear, Noah riding piggyback on his father's shoulders, chattering excitedly about the big trees and clutching his most prized possession. A faded brown teddy bear with a blue ribbon around its neck that had been his constant companion since infancy. They pitched their tent near a cleared fire pit surrounded by thick moss and crooked birch trees that stood like pale ghosts among the darker evergreens. The clearing felt ancient, as if it had been used by travelers for generations, though no other campers were in sight. The fire ring was built from river stones, weathered smooth by countless seasons, and partially overgrown with the same emerald moss that carpeted the entire forest floor like a living blanket. Locals often warned visitors to avoid that particular section of the forest, calling it the Breach, a name rooted in old settler legends that spoke of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances. The stories varied in detail but shared common threads. People who entered this area reported feeling watched, heard voices with no source, experienced sudden temperature drops even on the warmest days. But to the Reeds, it was just another forgotten tale, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any wild place where civilization's grip grows thin. The first evening unfolded like something from a postcard. Andrew proved surprisingly adept at building a campfire, coaxing flames from damp kindling while Melissa organized their supplies with the efficiency of someone rediscovering long-dormant camping skills. Noah explored the perimeter of their campsite with boundless 3-year-old energy, his teddy bear tucked under one arm as he collected treasures: smooth stones, interesting pine cones, a blue jay feather that had caught his eye. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they roasted hot dogs over the open flames, the simple meal tasting better than any restaurant fare. Noah managed to get more marshmallow on his face than in his mouth during their attempt at s'mores, his delighted giggles echoing off the surrounding trees. The teddy bear sat propped against a log beside him, a silent witness to the family's happiness. When darkness finally claimed the forest, they sat around the dying fire, Andrew pointing out constellations visible through breaks in the canopy, while Melissa hummed old songs from her own childhood camping trips. The sounds of the night forest created a natural symphony. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the gentle whisper of wind through countless leaves. Noah began to yawn around 9 o'clock, his eyelids growing heavy despite his protests that he wasn't tired. They tucked him into his small sleeping bag inside the tent, the teddy bear with its red ribbon nestled securely beside him. Within minutes, the boy was fast asleep, his breathing soft and regular in the peaceful darkness. Andrew and Melissa remained by the fire for another hour, talking quietly about their hopes for the weekend, about how good it felt to disconnect from phones and emails and the constant demands of modern life. Neither mentioned the strange sensation they'd both experienced throughout the evening, the feeling of being observed from the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Some instincts are better left unexamined in places where shadows hold dominion. That night, according to the 911 call made by Andrew at exactly 2:11 a.m., Noah had vanished. The emergency recording would later be analyzed by investigators, Andrew's voice tight with panic as he struggled to explain the impossible to a dispatcher trained to handle the rational world's emergencies. He claimed they had tucked the boy into his sleeping bag after dinner, right beside his favorite stuffed animal, a faded brown teddy bear. The routine had been no different from countless bedtimes at home, complete with a whispered good night and a gentle kiss on the forehead. Andrew's account was fragmentary but consistent. He had awakened around 2 a.m., roused by some indefinable unease that pulled him from deep sleep. The forest was utterly silent, an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, no wind moving through the trees. Just a profound stillness that made him reach for his flashlight with hands that were already beginning to tremble. When Andrew woke up a few hours later to stoke the fire, he found the tent flap was open, hanging like a gaping mouth in the darkness. The fire had burned down to barely glowing embers, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. His first thought was that Noah had gotten up to relieve himself, a reasonable assumption for a 3-year-old who might not want to wake his parents for such a simple need. But when he called softly into the darkness, his voice seemed to disappear into the forest without even an echo. When he turned his flashlight toward the tent and peered inside, his heart stopped. Melissa was still sleeping peacefully in her bag, but Noah's was empty. Not rumpled as if he had climbed out, but somehow undisturbed, as if his small body had simply dematerialized. The tent flap was open, and Noah was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints in the soft earth beyond their immediate campsite, no disturbed vegetation to show where a 3-year-old might have wandered, no scuffed ground or torn fabric on the surrounding bushes. The response was swift and comprehensive. By dawn, Hollow Creek Reserve had been transformed from a place of serene isolation into a hub of frantic activity. Sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and state police officers converged on the remote location, their vehicles forming an incongruous caravan along the narrow dirt roads that had never been designed for such traffic. Search teams combed Hollow Creek for weeks, their voices calling Noah's name until they grew hoarse, the sound echoing strangely among the massive tree trunks before being swallowed by the forest's indifferent silence. The search pattern expanded outward from the campsite in ever-widening circles, volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through underbrush that caught at their clothes and scratched their skin. Every fallen log was examined, every cluster of boulders searched, every stream bed carefully inspected for any sign of a small boy. Helicopters scanned the thick canopy from above, their rotors creating an alien whoop-whoop-whoop that sent forest creatures fleeing deeper into the wilderness. Thermal imaging cameras swept back and forth, searching for any heat signature that might indicate human presence. The pilots reported that the forest canopy was so dense in places that they could barely see the ground, creating a green maze that could easily conceal secrets. Dogs picked up a faint trail that led from the tent toward a ridge on the eastern edge of the clearing. The scent trail was weak but definite, meandering between massive tree trunks and over fallen logs carpeted with moss. For nearly 200 yards, the trail held, giving searchers hope that they were finally making progress. Then, as though Noah had simply evaporated, the trail abruptly ended near a ridge where ancient boulders had tumbled down from some long-ago geological upheaval. The search dogs, experienced animals with years of successful rescues behind them, seemed as confused as their handlers. They circled the area where the scent disappeared, whining softly as if puzzled by their own failure. One handler later described it as the strangest thing he'd ever witnessed. The dogs acted as if Noah had walked to that exact spot and then simply ceased to exist. Some speculated he was taken by wildlife. Black bears were known to inhabit the area, and mountain lions, though rare, were not unheard of. Others pointed fingers at the parents, whispering about family secrets and hidden motives. But there was no evidence to support any theory. No blood to suggest an animal attack. No torn clothing caught on thorns or branches. Nothing to indicate violence of any kind. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate search. Every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius was questioned and their whereabouts verified. Transients and drifters known to frequent the area were tracked down and interviewed. Background checks were run on every volunteer who had joined the search effort. Nothing. Noah Reid had simply vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Noah's case quickly turned cold, joining the unfortunate ranks of missing children whose fate would remain forever unknown. The media attention, intense for the first 2 weeks, gradually faded as other stories claimed the headlines. The search teams were eventually called off, their equipment packed away, their hope extinguished. The forest returned to its ancient silence, keeping its secrets as it had for millennia. The years that followed were marked by a peculiar kind of suspended animation for those touched by Noah's disappearance. Andrew and Melissa Reid, their marriage unable to survive the weight of unanswered questions and unprocessed grief, divorced in 2008. They had tried counseling, tried supporting each other through the initial investigation, tried maintaining some semblance of normal life. But the empty bedroom down the hall, with its unused toys and unmade bed, had become a shrine to possibilities that would never be realized. Andrew threw himself into his architectural practice, designing buildings with an almost manic precision, as if creating structures that would last for centuries could somehow compensate for his failure to protect the most important thing in his life. He rarely spoke of Noah except to the occasional investigator who would call with questions about some new theory or lead that inevitably went nowhere. Melissa moved to California, where the absence of familiar places made it easier to pretend that the past was just a nightmare from which she had finally awakened. But even there, 3,000 miles from Hollow Creek, she would sometimes catch herself buying children's clothes or toys before remembering that she no longer had anyone to give them to. The case file remained officially open but practically dormant, gathering dust in a filing cabinet at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Occasionally, a new detective would review the evidence, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators had missed. But the conclusion was always the same. Noah Reid had vanished without a trace, as completely as if he had never existed. 14 years later, in 2017, a group of university students were camping in the same reserve for a folklore podcast project. Emma Rodriguez, Marcus Chen, and Sam Webb were graduate students from Portland State University, pursuing research into the oral traditions and unexplained phenomena that clustered around remote locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. They'd read about the area's strange history and wanted to record overnight audio near the breach, hoping to document the acoustic anomalies that locals had reported for generations. The students had chosen Hollow Creek Reserve specifically because of its reputation for strangeness. The Noah Reid case was part of their research, but they were more interested in the deeper patterns. The indigenous stories that spoke of the area as a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The settler accounts of mysterious lights and unexplained sounds. The pattern of disappearances that seemed to occur with disturbing regularity throughout the area's recorded history. They arrived on a crisp October afternoon when the deciduous trees had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, creating a tapestry of color against the eternal green of the evergreens. The clearing looked much the same as it had 14 years earlier, the ancient fire ring still there, though filled with rotting leaves and small debris that had accumulated during years of disuse. Their plan was methodical and scientific. Emma, who specialized in acoustic folklore, had brought sophisticated recording equipment designed to capture the subtlest sounds. They would set up base camp in the clearing, then take turns monitoring different locations throughout the forest during the night hours when paranormal activity was most commonly reported. As evening approached, they built a fire in the old stone ring and discussed their research over a simple dinner of canned soup and sandwiches. The stories they had collected were remarkably consistent across different time periods and sources. People reported hearing voices in languages they didn't recognize, seeing lights that moved through the forest without any apparent source, experiencing sudden temperature drops that had no meteorological explanation. One of them, while gathering firewood near the old pit, tripped over something soft protruding slightly from the earth. Sam Webb had been selected for the first wood-gathering expedition, partly because of his woodcraft experience and partly because the others were busy setting up recording equipment. The area around the clearing was littered with deadfall from previous winter storms. Branches and entire trees that had fallen during the fierce winds that regularly swept through the mountain passes. He was working methodically, selecting pieces that would burn well and stacking them near the fire ring, when his foot caught on something that definitely wasn't wood. The object had some give to it, a softness that suggested organic matter, but not the firm resistance of a fallen branch or the unyielding hardness of a stone. Thinking it might be an animal, perhaps a deer that had died during the previous winter and was now in the process of being reclaimed by the forest, they dug with their hands. The three students worked together, carefully brushing away the layer of moss and decomposing leaves that covered the mysterious object. The material beneath was clearly artificial, some kind of fabric that had been buried for an extended period. As more of it was revealed, the shape became unmistakably familiar. The arms, the legs, the rounded head of a stuffed animal. What they uncovered was no less haunting. A dirt-caked, torn teddy bear, its button eyes missing, one ear shredded, and its blue ribbon faded. The once brown fur was now a mottled gray-green, stained by years of contact with the acidic forest soil. Its fabric was stiff with moisture and age, and the seams had rotted open at the bottom, revealing stuffing that had become compacted and discolored over time. The bear had clearly been buried for years, but something about its placement seemed deliberate. It wasn't buried deeply enough to prevent eventual discovery, nor was it carelessly discarded. Instead, it appeared to have been placed with almost ritualistic care, positioned so that natural processes would eventually bring it to the surface. When the group turned it over, something fell out. A rusted locket that had been hidden within the deteriorated stuffing. Despite its age and exposure to the elements, the locket's clasp still functioned, opening to reveal a tiny photo of a smiling toddler, remarkably well preserved within the sealed metal case. The students looked at each other with growing understanding. They had all researched the Noah Reed case extensively as part of their folklore project. They recognized the brown teddy bear from the newspaper photographs that had been published during the original search. The child in the locket's photograph matched exactly the images of Noah Reed that had appeared in missing person posters throughout the region. The police were contacted immediately, their dispatch receiving the call at approximately 3:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. Within hours, Hollow Creek Reserve was once again swarming with law enforcement vehicles, their presence creating an eerie echo of the scene from 14 years earlier. Detective Ray Morrison, now graying and approaching retirement, found himself returning to the case that had haunted the latter half of his career. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same location, the same mystery, but now with the first tangible evidence they'd had since Noah's disappearance. The teddy bear was photographed extensively from every angle before being carefully bagged and transported to the state crime laboratory. Chain of custody procedures were followed with meticulous care. Everyone involved understood that this could be the breakthrough they had all hoped for, the key that might finally unlock the mystery of what had happened to Noah Reed. Forensics confirmed it. The bear had once belonged to Noah Reed. Despite years of burial and exposure to the elements, enough genetic material remained in the fabric for DNA analysis. The results were unambiguous. This was definitely the stuffed animal that had been photographed in the Reed family home. The constant companion that had shared Noah's bed every night until that terrible weekend in 2003. The photograph in the locket was subjected to similar analysis. Paper degradation and chemical testing confirmed its age, while facial recognition software confirmed the identity of the child in the image. It was Noah Reed, captured in a moment of innocent happiness that now seemed unbearably poignant. Investigators returned to Hollow Creek with cadaver dogs, their equipment, and a renewed sense of purpose. The discovery of the teddy bear had provided the first tangible lead in over a decade, and everyone involved was determined to follow it wherever it might lead. The dogs reacted almost immediately upon arrival at the clearing. Their behavior was unmistakable, the focused intensity, the specific patterns of movement that indicated the presence of human remains. And this time, only 20 yards from the original fire pit, they discovered a shallow grave, one that had likely gone undetected due to its clever camouflage with moss and branches. The burial site was a masterpiece of concealment. Natural materials had been used to disguise the disturbed earth. Moss had been carefully transplanted to cover the area. Branches had been arranged to look as if they had fallen naturally, and the entire site had been designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest floor. It was the work of someone who understood both the forest environment and the techniques that search teams would use. The excavation was conducted with archaeological precision, every layer of soil carefully examined and documented. Inside were bone fragments consistent with a child of Noah's age, partially preserved clothing that matched the descriptions given by the Reed family, and traces of animal interference that suggested the remains had been accessible to small scavengers at some point during the burial. But the most chilling detail was the soil. It had been disturbed multiple times after 2003. Forensic analysis revealed distinct layers that indicated the grave had been opened and closed repeatedly over the years. The soil composition, the settling patterns, and the distribution of organic material all pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Someone had been returning to this site, again and again, for purposes that defied rational explanation. What shocked investigators even more was that the bear itself hadn't been buried with the boy. The stuffed animal showed clear evidence of having been interred separately and much more recently. The soil staining patterns, the degree of decomposition, and the botanical evidence all indicated that the teddy bear had been recently placed, barely covered with just enough debris to ensure its eventual discovery. As if someone had come back after all those years to bury a bear, positioning it precisely where it would be found by the right people at the right time. Andrew and Melissa, who had divorced years earlier, were brought in for questioning despite the obvious emotional trauma of learning that their son's remains had been found. Both were cooperative with the investigation, answering every question with the exhausted patience of people who had been through this process before. Both denied returning to the woods in the years since Noah's disappearance. Andrew had deliberately avoided the entire region, finding the memories too painful to bear. Melissa had moved to California specifically to escape the constant reminders of her loss. Neither had any reason to return to the place where their world had fallen apart. Both were cleared by cell tower records that provided precise documentation of their movements during the periods when the grave had been disturbed. Surveillance footage from various locations, DNA analysis of the burial site, and financial records all supported their alibis. There was no evidence whatsoever that either parent had returned to Hollow Creek Reserve. And yet, the question remained: who came back after all those years to bury a bear? The forensic evidence painted an impossible picture. Someone with intimate knowledge of the burial site had been returning regularly, carefully maintaining the grave, and eventually placing Noah's teddy bear where it would be discovered. But that someone wasn't his parents, wasn't any known associate of the family, and wasn't anyone who appeared in the extensive investigative files that had been compiled over the years. Noah's case was closed quietly as a cold case recovery. The official paperwork filed with minimal fanfare and no press conference. The cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. The forensic evidence was insufficient to establish exactly how or when Noah had died, only that his death had occurred shortly after his disappearance in 2003. Detective Morrison retired 6 months later, carrying with him the weight of questions that would never be answered. In his final report, he noted that the case represented one of the most puzzling investigations of his career, involving evidence that seemed to follow no logical pattern and circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Unofficially, whispers about Hollow Creek continue to circulate among law enforcement personnel, search and rescue volunteers, and the tight-knit community of people who live in the area's small towns. The story has taken on the quality of a modern legend, told in hushed voices around campfires, and discussed in internet forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The forest preserve was quietly closed to public access, with warning signs posted along the access roads citing environmental concerns and the need to protect sensitive wildlife habitat. Park rangers patrol the perimeter regularly, though they rarely venture into the deep forest where the old camping area lies hidden among the ancient trees. And the teddy bear? It's sealed in an evidence locker, cataloged under recovered item number 4137. The stuffed animal sits in a climate-controlled room in the basement of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. One item among thousands of pieces of evidence from cases both solved and unsolved. Occasionally, a new detective will request to examine it, hoping that fresh eyes might spot some detail that previous investigators had missed. But the bear keeps its secrets as faithfully as the forest that sheltered it for so many years. But some say, if you camp near the breach, you'll hear a child's laugh deep in the woods. Faint, echoed, as if it's coming from somewhere just beneath the soil. Local residents and the occasional hiker who manages to reach the area despite the official closure report the same phenomenon with unsettling consistency. The laughter is always distant, always fleeting, always just at the edge of hearing. Some describe it as joyful, the innocent delight of a child at play. Others find it melancholy, tinged with a loneliness that seems to echo through the centuries. Park rangers, when pressed, will neither confirm nor deny these reports. But veteran officers sometimes share stories off the record, about cold spots that appear without warning, about equipment that malfunctions in specific locations, about the persistent feeling of being watched during patrols of the deeper forest areas. The truth about what happened to Noah Reed, about who maintained his grave for 14 years, about who placed his teddy bear where it would eventually be found, remains buried as deeply as the boy himself once was. But in the deep woods of northern Oregon, where ancient trees stand guard over ancient secrets, the mystery endures, patient as stone, enduring as the forest itself. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the forest falls into that profound silence that seems to hold its breath, visitors to the area report hearing something that chills them to the bone. The distant sound of a 3-year-old's laughter, echoing up from the earth as if the very ground itself remembers the joy of a child who never came home.